Hello, everyone. We are live here today for a very exciting interview with Veda Austin, who is a dear water sister who her relationship to water is truly something beautiful, something profound, and I'm excited to share it with you because it's so inspiring. I've been inspired by this woman for years. She has developed a way of communicating with water that is unique and completely accessible to everyone. And I see she just joined us here, so let's wait till she can come on. Welcome, welcome everybody. Welcome Haley. Welcome Niswaz, Unrefined Acres. Here we go. Welcome Tor Dorman. Welcome Ezekiel and Cytomegalovirus. Glad you're all here with us. Hi, Veda.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. Every time I've gone live, my internet's been kind of weird and I don't know why. So,
Seems to be working fine for now. Can everybody give us a thumbs up in the chat if you can hear Veda? We'll assume it's fine.
yay! Oh, that's good.
How's
Great
your
news.
day going?
It's going great, thank you. It's morning for me and it's just been raining and it's just stopped, so it's perfect time to talk about water.
Awesome. Yeah, you're all refreshed. You've been having that baptism from the sky, so the water wisdom is fresh in your sphere now.
Exactly. Well, it's so
Beautiful.
nice to be here. I mean, you were actually on my advanced workshop and shared some what I call mic drop moments for people. And I think that, I'd love to talk about some of the things we discussed during that time as well on this call.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember exactly what we discussed specifically, but I do remember getting off that call and by the end of it just feeling so nourished and so filled with so much inspiration from all the ground that we covered. And there's so much complementarity, I think, to our work and so much symmetry in the way that we see water and our relationship with water. And we've come at it from very different angles, of course, but I'm so excited to have you on with us today. And maybe let's just dive right in to the deep end. What do you say?
Yeah, I'm definitely up for that.
Okay, awesome. So then, what is your conception of water's relationship to life and death?
Mhm. Well, it's actually interesting because I observe water so much that I've observed we have a relationship and a conversation. And so for anyone that's not familiar with my work with hydroglyphs, which has been the last 4.5 years of my 9 years of researching water, but I've discovered that there is a symbolic language that appears in the crystallography or the frozen ice that is very consistent. So I would say first that water it doesn't read words, but it does absorb the energy of words. And when it does that, as it crystallizes, it forms in very specific shapes relative to that word. And for me to say I have one hydroglyph, I need to have seen that repeat itself at least 50 times. What's interesting about hydroglyphs, and this is very relative to this question you asked me, is that they have layers of meaning. So I discovered really hydroglyphs in a very organic way, as has been pretty much nearly all of my work. And it was because my son, who was a teenager then, he actually was saying to me, I've looked at Masaru Emoto's work and there's very much contrasting pictures in classical music kind of versus heavy metal. And he said, I don't really like either of those. And he said, I want to listen to rap. I like Tupac and I like all these guys. And he said, does that mean that the water inside of me is like hating it? And I said, no, water is never in judgment. And that's one thing I absolutely stand by and believe. From all the times that I've seen water respond, I've never seen it come from any place of judgment, more as an observer. And so it's interesting because when he said that, I was like, I want to show him what I mean. So I played all different kind of genres of music, from reggae and drum and bass and African like music and all different kinds of music from around the world and chanting, but also electronic music, you know, and some Snoop Dogg and some Tupac and some Little River Band, like all these different kind of genres. And what was interesting is that I observed that water seemed to love to pick up on a word that was very much repeated or symbolic of the song. And in one of the first that I did many repeat studies with, I used a song that many people might have heard of called Stairway to Heaven. And I did that around about 12 times. And in every single petri dish, after playing the song to my petri dish of water and then freezing it using a special technique that I've basically kind of discovered over the course of time, which is just a short-term freeze. And what I see is that, oh, there's this stairway image appearing in the ice. And when it first happened, I thought it was interesting. But when it kept happening, I'm like, you know, I wonder if that means stairway. And then I thought, oh, well, I'm going to write the word stairway. So I wrote the word stairway, put my petri dish of water on top of it for 30 seconds. I just happened to like that number. It's not too long and not too short. Froze it using my technique, and there I saw the stairway. I'm like, oh, I'm going to try that again. And I kept doing it. And in my mind, 50 was a non-random number. It was like too much kind of repetitiveness to say that it's a coincidence. And then I thought, you know, I think that that means stairway. But then I thought, well, what do you do with a stairway, at least relative to that song? And so I thought, well, you climb up it. So I wrote the words climb up, and I kept seeing the stairway, and it kept repeating. So I thought, well, this is very interesting, because this means that there are these layers of meaning in this symbol that I've discovered. And then I thought, well, what else is there? And now I have something in the range of 36 hydroglyphs, that I call them, which have taken me 4.5 years to develop. Now, what's relative to your question is that when I used the word living, I saw a very specific glyph. And I also saw that one of its layered meanings is gratitude. So those are two most potent meanings, or most common meanings, should we say. But a man who was told he only had a few months to live, he reached out to me and he said, look, could you please ask water what death looks like? So I wrote the word death. And when I did that, I kept, and used the same technique, I kept seeing the living glyph. And I'm like, oh, is this right? Is this right? It took me, you know, about 40 times of doing it and seeing the same glyph for the living glyph for me to suddenly have that penny drop, where I'm like, oh, right, of course. Because we love to label things in the world as humans. And we tend to label water as dead water if it's polluted, or dead water if it's like even municipal tap water. I've heard people call it dead water. But actually, water doesn't die. Water is always in one of its stages, and it will always evaporate and then come back and reincarnate in all these different ways. And there's subtleties in every single stage of those phases of water. And I always say the secrets are in the subtleties. They really, truly are. And so when I saw, oh, this is a layered of meaning, the death is a layered meaning of living, I really started to observe how water observes words. So if that's the frozen energy of the word death, well, to water, the death really is a transition. Death is another aspect of living. And so in its observation of itself, and someone once said to me, what if water is expressing its consciousness through us and every living thing on this planet to observe itself from every perceivable and imperceivable perspective? Then that kind of makes sense. So I think that as far as how water pertains to death, firstly, I don't think that death in the way we understand it, on the whole. I'm not saying everybody has that feeling. And I am going to probably shut that window because there's a big truck like backing down. So hopefully he's not going to start jackhammering or something. But I'll just see. I think this is going fast. And so, yeah, death itself to water is simply a transition. And so I also have observed where people have asked me, is water conscious or is my consciousness affecting the water? And, you know, there have been multiple things I've tried to see whether I can somehow take my consciousness out. But, you know, it's a very, very difficult thing when you're observing something that we call consciousness with our consciousness to take away the consciousness. It's a very entangled kind of quantum thing. But one of the things, without even thinking about that specific question, but that I have done, is when I've wanted to communicate with someone like my mum who passed away in 1999. And it's where you are kind of asking a question, but you get a response of which no one else in the world could have known. And so I'm always interested. That's so funny. As I just said that, when I just talk about my mum, sometimes birds show up. This little sparrow literally just flew up to the window and like just flew away. And so, you know, that still gets me. Like, you know, it's one of those things I often say, you know, we are all bodies of water. Our entire life is full of memories. And when we depart this vehicle, this body, one of the greatest gifts we leave behind is the memory, our memory in the heart of somebody else. And so that lives in me, the memory of my mum, the memory of people who have passed. It never goes away. And so when I asked water, could you please connect to my mum? It showed me something so special. To put it into context, I used to live in Japan, and Mum and I would write letters to each other, physical, real letters, because we didn't have cell phones. Actually, cell phones were like giant bricks back then, and we didn't have email. So we would write letters, and at the end of every letter, my mother would attempt to draw some kind of circle, and she'd draw a little heart inside. But the circles were really misshapen. Mum's circles, it should be the first to tell you, were like terrible. And I kept those, I had this pile of them, and they were very special to me, and no one else saw them. And so that symbol of this misshapen circle with a heart in the middle kind of really represented Mum to me and her love for me. And so that's exactly what I saw in the crystallography of the ice. And, you know, it meant so much to me. And at the same time, now it's interesting because on her birthday in January each year, I always ask the same question and I get the same response. And so it is like Mum used to say to me, you know, even after I've left this body, I will always be with you. And this seems very, very real to me through the realms of water. And so when it comes to is water conscious or is my consciousness impacting the water, it's kind of like asking another question is like, does water also have a sovereign voice? And it's interesting because I've asked water questions that I don't have a visual for, like, for example, the word ego. It doesn't bring up a specific image for me. But when I wrote the word ego, water designed this giant inflated body with these huge shoulders and this long skinny neck and this face pointing away and this giant balloon head. And it could be in an art gallery just called ego because it was so profound. And at the same time, I wrote the word trust, and there was a little stick figure on like a surfboard. And so it's interesting because water seems to be able to respond, and it's this very unusual way that I can't explain or or I don't expect. And I think that's the key, to actually not expect it. That's part of the learning and the relationship for me. It is about learning about selfless love, because the way and you said this really beautifully too, is that treat water as you would like to be treated. And my mum used to read me this book called The Water Babies when I was little, and there was this woman in there called Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By. And a big part of my work with water and relationship with water is about learning how to step back out of control. So often we don't think we're controlling people, but then we start working with water and it doesn't do what we expect. And there's a frustration that can easily happen. And you're like, oh, I have to look at that. And so, it is interesting, because when I am really dehydrated, or if I am very frustrated and might have just been driving along the motorway and heaps of traffic and kids going, are we there yet? And come back and think it's a good idea to do crystallography, water won't play with me. And so it just won't design, not out of judgment, just because it doesn't actually join me at that particular frequency. It resonates higher than that. And with the dehydration, I think being hydrated actually helps to form that communication. And so when it comes to death, it's such a big thing, but I think light is an important part in this as well. Because with light, I've managed to capture a couple of really cool images in the freezer where water's just starting to freeze, and there is this kind of spike that comes out, and I've captured this halo, this light coming out of this ice spike. And I actually think water has a type of internal light, and I think it is the light that paves the way for the design of the ice. And excuse me, an Indigenous woman, she said to me once, that she could speak to bees. And she said that she used to watch the hives for long periods of time. And she said that a bee came out and communicated to her that we don't mind you looking at our hive, but please don't look at it for too long, because your conscious expression is putting too much light in our hive. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because I just spoke at the annual water conference in Germany. And I was a little nervous to share that little bit of information because it's talking about someone talking to bees, but then I took to water, so, and so I was like, oh, this is a bunch of scientists and physicists and biologists. But there was this bit that I could see when I said it. There was all these oohs and ahs kind of coming, and I'm like, oh, there's some part of that that's made sense to them. And I think we can learn so much from an indigenous and ancient wisdom, because I feel that there is such an important part of that wisdom to play in our learnings and our love affairs with water. And so that is really important, in that there is this light aspect, this internal light source thing that is within the water, and that is in the water within us. And so over watching water for so long and observing it and observing how it responds to me and seeing how I can commune with my mum, and I've seen this happen with various other people, I'm starting to see that even within dreams, because that comes into, when are you not impacting the water? When is your consciousness not affecting the water? And I thought, well, maybe when I'm asleep. And so, but that might even be wrong. If you think in quantum terms, it's all entangled, because we've set these labels for dreams and awake and subconscious and conscious and all of these things, so we can feel safe in the understanding of what things are. But actually, everything is all connected, and it just seems like such a cliche, but it is one of the consistent things I keep hearing, seeing, reading, and seeing for myself, that it's true. Water is the connecting force of life. And it is the water that's in your cup has literally been through the trees and the birds, the animals, the earth, the sky, maybe the dinosaurs, your ancestors, and somehow that glass of water has actually found its way to you. It's made its way from goodness only knows where to get to you, to have right in front of you. And so a friend of mine used to say this, and I think it's beautiful. When people ask, what is the best water to drink? And firstly, it's a very first world question, and we're lucky to actually have water to drink and have that question. But he would always say, it's the water in the glass in front of you because it's made its way to you. And to honor that, we live in such a throwaway society where we take so much for granted. But you take water away and there is chaos, and then there is death. We can't live without it. And that's why I always find it interesting, because we're able to say that water is life, but not many people are willing to say that it's alive. And I think that through a lot of teachings, we can learn a lot of more of the ancient teachings, where even within the indigenous, like my dad is Maori, and in New Zealand, we were the first country in the world to actually make a river have the rights of personhood, because the Maori, the Whanganui tribe, they fought really hard to actually be able to look after their river, because they saw that the mouth of the river was being fed all this effluence. They saw that the belly was being like stripped of its stones and rocks and things, and they saw that the headwaters were being diverted, which to them was aquatic decapitation. And so they petitioned for a long time, and actually they were able to get this river to have rights of a person, because they consider water not to be a resource but an ancestor and a family member. And someone also, said water isn't a resource, it's a relative. And I like to say that water isn't a resource, it is source. So we all have this kind of familiar way of seeing water, and yet, so how can water kind of connect us to our spirit, our soul? Like, what is that about? And you've talked a bit about the spinal fluid. I'd love to hear you talk about that again, because I find that really, really interesting, because I've been very much on a quest around these two types of water that I keep seeing. Two types of water in egg albumin, for example. Two types of water at the stage where I have my technique, which is liquid on top and ice underneath. And the Maori word for spirit is wairua, which means two waters, again, which is kind of the spiritual and physical waters. And so I've often thought, after observing and talking to many people, that water in one of its most spiritual aspects is the observer. Because everything that we experience within our body is actually in the internal world. And so we see through our eye lens, we hear through our ears, we taste through our mouth and tongue, and feel through our fingers, and all these different things. But so what do we ever actually experience outside of our physical realm, our physical body? But we can observe ourselves. And in the observations, of which, I know many people have had that experience. Even you need to take any kind of plant medicine, and you might be able to have the experience of being more of an observer. My son recently broke his wrist, and it was a pretty bad break, and we had to go to the hospital. And the doctors were there, and they said, no, we have to really put some pressure, so we have to give him a drug called ketamine. And I'm like, oh God, I've heard of that. Like, I'm like, oh, my baby's going to be, is he going to be okay? And so he said, look, I'm just going to inject it. And then my son's name's Rama, he's not going to really be with us anymore, as far as he's going to be out of his body in a way. that's the way he described it. I'm like, okay. So I watched him. My son, he just turned 15 yesterday. So happy birthday, Rama. And he said, and Rama was like waiting for this experience to happen. Within 4 seconds, it was 1, 2, 3. Rama said, what the he didn't finish. His mouth was open, his eyes were bulging out of his head, and the nurses started yanking on his arm. And I'm watching, going, oh my God, this is so traumatizing for me. But what I could immediately see is that Rama, in the same exact way that when I went to see my mother's body in the funeral home, his energy wasn't in his body anymore. I could see it. I could see that he was awake, alive. It wasn't exactly the same as Mum, but you could see that there was something not in his body anymore. And when he came out of that experience, I said, look, what was that like? And he said that he watched the nurses yanking on his body. He was outside of his body. He watched them do it. And he didn't have any emotion about it at all. It was like, he wasn't attached to his body at all. It was an observation. He also said that he saw lots of holes and like geometries that he went through and into. And it was like, he said there were no more words he could really use to explain it. But that experience ties in with people who I've interviewed who have near-death experiences, where 3 of them, they said this almost like word for word the same thing. They said they have this sense of rising, which is what a gas does. So potentially that spirit aspect is an ether or a type of fluid that can maybe turn into a gas, or perhaps it's a gas that rises. And in that aspect of leaving the body, but still being somehow connected through electrical charge, which I believe is the connecting part to the physical, then they immediately said that they looked down upon their body being resuscitated, and they said, I hope that person's going to be okay. There was no attachment anymore to the physical body or what was happening to it, or even an identification of being a body. And so it was very much in alignment with that observing, non-judging aspect that I believe water truly is. And so it's one of the reasons that I like to use spring water for my crystallography, or seawater, or any water that I can collect, compared to distilled water, because I find that distilled water, and I'm not talking about drinking water, I'm talking about doing my work in crystallography, is more in an observer space, because the minerals and salts, which are an important piece, because we're not fresh water, we're not distilled water, we are an ocean, we are salt water. Salt also has an electrical charge, and salt is a crystal, and crystals we use in all our technology to store vast amounts of information. And so I think it's one of the ways we can store and have cellular memory, because of that incredible liquid crystal that water and salt become when they're in this beautiful union. So I like to use those kinds of waters because they have the salts, and I like to use glass petri dishes, because glass essentially is made of silica. Silica is a type of crystal. It helps the water to store information for longer. So when I use distilled water, what I find is I don't get very much imagery relative to what I used to see, and that is because I think it's more in an observing space without the minerals or salts, and in that space it's a kind of non-doing, whereas with the salts and the minerals it's kind of like water is more an active participant, but with the ability, just like us, to also observe. So it has a lot of complexity within those realms. But I think that this electrical charge that HeartMath can read, that we have around us, that our organs put out, our heart and brain, gut and all these things, that also the fact that we're salt water, I think there is also a charge in that. So when people have those experiences of like walking into a kind of creepy room maybe, and it feels like weird, your gut's going, oh, I don't like this and I don't really know why, especially if you haven't been preempted, like, oh, this is a haunted house or something. You just go in and you feel if you're sensitive. It's like, oh, or that feeling of like when you meet someone and you're like, have this immediate connection and you feel like you've known them your whole life. And it's like, God, like you just feel so familiar. And sometimes you have the opposite and you're like, oh, no, I don't know. I don't know what it is about you, but I feel like there's something that doesn't click for me. Well, I think this energy field that we have, this electrical charge, very much is part of the way we feel energy. So I think that there is a lot of, well, I don't think there's a lot of water that is in the air we don't even think about because we can't see it. And it's more in a subtle realm, I would say. And that water, the fact that we breathe means we create water around us. And so that water within the air is attracted to our electrical charge. And that gives us this ability to have this energetic web around us. And it enables us to both feel energy, and often if there's something bad that's happened in a house or a room, that energy will be heavier and more dense and easier to feel and have a bigger reaction sometimes. And it also can share information about us out into the world. So when you meet somebody you have that immediate connection with, it's often because those patterns are very similar. And so it's kind of ties in with that twin flame, more like being like a twin patterns. And so, and the opposite is when you find someone who has incredibly different structures, patterns to you. And there is this kind of disconnect happening because nothing fits. So as you're falling or rising in love, then it's often a matter of starting to kind of feel out the same patterns and start to create even new patterns, which I dive into in more of my advanced workshops, which comes into Kundalini and these various different practices in Tantra where you're creating an entirely new pattern together, which is really incredibly beautiful. And that ties in with that, potentially our spirit essence being and moving through the spinal fluid. So, and then creating that beautiful amrit within the mouth and in the throat. So that's a lot about those essences and energy. And that when I think people have near-death experiences and they're able to come back into their body rather than go completely, then I think that that's because there is still some weak charge, because the brain, there's still some kind of function or electrical charge coming from it even after 10 minutes after the heart stops beating. So it's still a charge. The fact that they've done a horrible, but I mean, I'm going to share it anyway, but I think they did it on mice or rats. And I feel so bad for all these animals which have been tested on. It just, it's so horrible. But they did a test where they basically killed a mouse or a rat, and they were able to observe that the fluids somehow still moved for an hour after its death. And so even any movement of any fluid is going to create some subtle charge. So my friend Hone Edmonds, he wrote a whole book. I think you can follow him if you want to. And he was one of the people I interviewed. And his heart had stopped beating for 25 minutes. And he had a full experience afterwards of like, and wrote a whole book about his his near-death experience. But he was able to come back. So even after that period of time, there was some energy able to come back into the physical. But I think that once everything is gone, then that subtle body, that soul, that essence, or however you like to call it, that energy is able to then fully leave. And that silver thread, or that electrical charge, is no longer there. And so someone once asked me about homeopathy. Like, why do I think that the essence, like the homeopathic remedies which have been highly diluted, that seem to have more potency, why is that? And I overlay that with some of this conversation I've just had with you, whereby I think that the closer the essence comes to spirit, so I think that all living things have an energy or a spirit. I mean, you can, replace the word with what feels comfortable. But I think that I like to call it the spirit of a plant. For example, let's say for a plant remedy, essentially, as it's being diluted further and further and further and further and further, that essence is becoming purer and purer and purer towards being like spirit. So that thread is going finer and finer and finer, and it finally gets to this essence, this kind of spirit aspect, which you can't even hardly identify within such high dilutions. But it's so pure that someone once said to me that death is like taking off an uncomfortable shoe. Then you get to like really expand and experience what it truly is to be in spirit. And so it was interesting because I think that's kind of why it's so potent, that those dilutions, because I think they're becoming more close to spirit essence than being anywhere within a body realm anymore. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
And it's such a juicy, multifaceted answer. There's so much here. I feel like every single sentence I want to unpack it with you. And constantly while you were talking, it's like, oh yeah, and this, and this, and this. So I'm just gonna breathe for a second because, I mean, honestly, just to give people a second to soak that in, like all of the wisdom that you shared. And water weaves through it all. We tend to think that water is life, but truthfully, she mediates life and death unequivocally, both of them. It's been said that the aging process is just a process of drying out. And there was Dr. Gilbert Ling who said that he believed that death itself is when we lose structure in our biowaters. So I love when you were talking about how water itself emits light and emits energy, and that you can actually read that in the electromagnetism of the body. And even when someone is technically dead for quite a while afterwards, Dr. Korokov did some studies where he showed that whether it's in people or plants or animals, you can actually measure the biophoton radiation from their bodies for around 60 hours after death. So potentially that may be as long as it takes for the biowater to gradually destructure. And I think different watersheds and different hydrological systems within our bodies have very different purposes in the way that they conduct our energy, our vitality, and our conscious awareness. So, for example, I believe, and I add the caveat with all of this, that water is such a mystery that no one has definitive answers. But from my research, I can say that I believe that our fascia holds our subconscious mind, and that it carries the memories throughout our life that are stored subconsciously. And so it's been shown that even when someone is completely brain dead, so they have zero electrical activity in the mind at all, and you would think that that would mean they are absolutely not present, when they come back after these after death experiences, they have full memory of everything that happened in the room. They can actually, speak of exact conversations that happened between their doctors in the hospital. And some people believe that that's because their subconscious is still very active through their fascial network. And your fascia, of course, is 80% water, 20% protein. And it's actually this hydraulic irrigation network that actually works to deliver hydration drop by drop to every single cell in your body. And then there's the cerebrospinal fluid, which has a completely different role and function in terms of how it keeps us alive, in the sense that I believe that the cerebrospinal fluid is where our actual consciousness, as opposed to the subconscious, our conscious is channeled. And actually, I think it was Dr. Randolph Stone who said that he believed that the soul swims in cerebrospinal fluid. And Dr. Mauro Zapatera, who has his MD and his PhD from Harvard, has devoted his entire career to studying the ways that cerebrospinal fluid actually is our liquid consciousness. So, of course, all water has access to the realm of infinite consciousness. I believe that that is directly proportional to the amount of hydrogen and the kind of hydrogen within the water. And we can get into the science about why I think that's true if we want to dive into that. But in terms of the cerebral spinal fluid, it's this highly structured, highly crystalline network of water that is basically only one molecule different from seawater. So when you're talking about, the crystals of salt in the body and how they actually give this capacity to conduct so much more energy, this particular crystalline liquid is very piezoelectric. So it actually emits light all the time. Now, all water does have access to the realms of light. Like we can say that well, it's been estimated, you can't measure photon by photon, but it's been estimated that there are about 1 trillion parts photons for every 1 part matter in every single molecule of water. So the 1 part matter would be the hydrogen and the oxygen, which are like barely even matter anyways, right? They're gases, and somehow magically and mysteriously they defy the laws of physics by two gases coming together and creating a liquid. Scientists still don't know how that happens. But even those two gases, the hydrogen and the oxygen, are compared to 1 trillion parts photons in the water. That's pretty much all water. Of course, it varies from quality to quality. But then in piezoelectric, highly conductive water like the cerebrospinal fluid, whenever you do certain practices, certain breathwork practices, certain bandhas in the yogic tradition where you hold and you squeeze in certain places, that actually activates the piezoelectricity of the cerebrospinal fluid. And you can see allegories in pretty much every single religion, every single mystic tradition, all of the greatest scriptures in human history, where in very symbolic and allegorical terms, they're telling the story of the journey of consciousness through the stairway to heaven, which is the vertebrae in your spinal column. And so the cerebral spinal fluid actually twists around your vertebrae, which are vortices, and in this double helix spiral up to the central ventricle of the brain. And of course, CSF bathes the entire brain. And I mean, we could talk about it for days and days and days, but I loved what you were saying earlier about water's relationship to the dreaming state. And one would think that if you're not actually conscious and awaking state, that your water wouldn't necessarily be responding to you. But actually, it's considered that the only reason that we are able to dream, just as the only reason that we're able to walk around in daily waking life, is because of our biowaters, of course. And so what happens in the dreaming state is you sort of draw inward into this inner lake of light, which is called the central ventricle. It was also called the Crystal Palace or the Cave of Brahman or Solomon's Temple. It's gone by so many different names, but basically it is this seawater inside the center of your brain that has tides just like the ocean, and it lights up all the time with literal light emissions. And in front of it is your pineal gland that has photoreceptors. And so this third eye, as it's called, is actually peering into this lake of light. And so what is it seeing there? What are the projections of light going through the prismatic crystals, the prismatic liquid crystals of the CSF? And then, of course, in the back of that, you also have your pituitary gland, which is the master regulatory gland of your endocrine system. And it basically determines like how you feel and perceive the world around you, through a hormonal state and that sort of thing. So, the Kogi tribe of Colombia say that all worlds of reality are contained within the holographic map of water, and that water is not only the hologram of all of this 3D existence, but also the dream worlds as well, and also the psychedelic worlds as well. Like when Rama went into that state with the ketamine, he likely was actually drawing inward into this lake of light that was being lit up in very new ways, and you have different access to it when your pineal gland starts releasing dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which just is like a way of sort of unlocking that crystal puzzle of the CSF. And it's so interesting because, in some traditions, there are different practices for cultivating the CSF in different ways. There's one Buddhist tradition where you do a certain practice, and then it's believed that you have connected your consciousness to the Buddha consciousness if a little drop of water appears at the fontanelle of your head. And there are other practices where you cultivate once a month. For about 2.5 to 3 days, you have the capacity to cultivate a very specific kind of cerebral spinal fluid that connects you to what they call Christ consciousness. It could go by so many different names, but it's called the chrism oil. And again, it's a very specific kind of water, and it takes a very specific cultivation to kind of to bring it forward in that way. And I really think that when it comes down to it, the more we go inward, inside of our waters, the less we actually, for one thing, you can spontaneously generate the production of metabolic water within your cells, which is highly deuterium depleted and very, very hydrating. Some deuteronomics experts, deuteronometicians, they're called, say that we shouldn't actually be drinking very much liquid water at all, but rather practicing hydrating lifestyle techniques that actually allow us to produce more metabolic water. And Dr. Tom Cowan talks a lot about the fact that our genes can actually generate de novo water as well. And I think that has a lot to do with the relationship of the DNA with the etheric field. I was reading an article just recently. Researchers at Cambridge have basically discovered that the origins of dark matter and dark fluid and the origins of RNA, which is the progenitor of DNA, they actually come from the same ancestor, and that ancestor is nanoclustered water. Water itself is the mother of dark energy and dark matter and the mother of RNA and DNA. And so the three of them, through quantum entanglement, are so connected. And it's like, again and again, the more we look out to the cosmos, what is the nature of existence? What is consciousness? What is life? It just brings us back again and again, because water shows us as within, so without, as above, so below. And Schauberger, I think, phrased this better than just about anyone, and I'm going to butcher the quote because I don't remember exactly how he said it. But he said something like when you implode inwards within your inner waters, you unlock nirvana, basically. I'll put it in the I'm going to post this. I see several people in the chat saying, please save this. I'm going to save it. And if I remember, I'll put it in the description what that quote was, because it was such a good one. But yeah, water teaches us everything is holographic, everything is fractal, everything is mirrored.
I like also recently you've shared about a Vedic from the Rig Veda, I think it was, and around water and the different elements. And I think that that's a really interesting thing and piece that you have shared with a lot of people around water being kind of the mother of the elements, where a lot of people think that they're so separate and they are very, very individual. And so I would recommend, I don't know if you want to share about that, and it's the most simple way you can. And then I really want to talk a little bit about dew. Now, I know my accent makes me sound like I'm saying Jew, but I think in America you say do. So I'm going to try and say that so people know what I'm meaning. But if you want to share that piece around the different elements, I think it's really interesting for people to know that, because they've been made so separate from water. Like there's this element and this element and this element. But it's actually really interesting to see how they were birthed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I always go back to what Goethe said. He said, all is water. And also Thales of Miletus, who was the very first philosopher ever in existence, he also said, water is the ground of all being. And, sometimes when people, and I'm sure you get this a lot in your work as well, when I first meet people and they're like, so what do you do? And I'm like, well, I teach about water. They're like, oh, it's just one of the elements. Like, why not teach about fire or air? Like, it's all the same, just one of the elements. But the truth is that water is the only element that can take the form of every other element and gives birth to every other element. And so just to run through them quickly, for example, and the more you look at any element, the more you see water ultimately. So for example, of course, we know that water can take the form of earth when it becomes ice. It can take the form of water when it becomes liquid. It can take the form of air when it becomes gas, and can take the form of fire when it becomes plasma. Water also contains all of the elements. So, unlike any other element, water contains the earth element in the form of dissolved minerals like electrolytes, contains the air element in the form of dissolved gases like oxygen and carbonic acid and hydrogen and all of that, contains the water element, obviously, as water, and contains the fire element because of the electromagnetic charges and the light that it stores. And then also, water gives birth to all of the elements. So, how did air even come into being on this planet? Why do we have an atmosphere at all? Well, originally, before anything else, before there was any atmosphere whatsoever, there was a giant super ocean called Panthalassa. And this giant, I mean, the entire earth was just water. She is a water being first and foremost. Primarily, we're so terra centric and like human centric in our thought processes. But I think that, this is so key to getting to know who is our earth and how can we protect her, is recognizing her history, who she is, where she comes from, what she needs, and all of that has to do with water. She's primarily a water being. So eventually this super ocean Panthalassa created air and gave birth to oxygen. And also, eventually, from Panthalassa, the earth started to rise up and land masses started to emerge from the water. And also, the fire element. I mean, water and fire have such a beautiful alchemical relationship with each other. It is just the most beautiful. There's almost no words for it. It's this alchemical marriage that again and again and again just proves to be one of the most awe-inspiring things. Actually, in an upcoming retreat, we're having a retreat here in the Yucatan in February, and we're doing a fire water experience where people go into a cenote and they actually hold fire in their hands, not like a torch that's on fire, but they actually set their hands on fire in a very safe way. And so you're literally merging with the two elements. I'm very excited about that. The total tangent. So pardon the rabbit trail, but yeah. So water gives birth to the fire element in the form of the sun, for example, which is the mother of all fire. And the sun was created and all stars are created inside of nebula. Our sun was created inside of the Orion cloud complex, which contains enough water to fill the Earth's oceans 10 million times. And so water actually midwifes the entire process of the birth of stars. And then even inside of the sun, there's so much water. It exists as superionic amorphous ice inside of the dark umbra or the sunspots. And technically the sun isn't really on fire, because for something to be on fire, it has to be in this constant state of combustion. And actually, it's more like a state of cold fusion. Like the sun is hydrogen that is imploding in such a way that it really is like liquid plasma. The same thing happens when you create water plasma in the laboratory. You could put your hand right next to water plasma and not get burned, even though the plasma itself is a fluid laser. We call it a flaser that can burn through any material at thousands of degrees. But because it's an implosive burning, it won't burn your hands, unlike an actual, fire if you put your hands around it. And the same is true of the sun. You could actually be right next to the sun. Most people don't realize this, and it wouldn't be very hot. It only creates heat when it interacts with the water that's in our atmosphere, and that's what warms up. And so, yeah, it's hydrogen, giant hydrogen ball, and hydrogen in Latin literally means hydro means water and gen creator. So even the sun, which is this giant ball of burning hydrogen, is just really a giant ball of the foundational elements of water. And Dr. Yul Brown, actually, after many decades of his researcher, he's the guy who invented Brown's gas, or I wouldn't say he invented it. He made great strides in it and invented a new method of using it. But yeah, he said by the end of his career, he said the sun is water, in essence. So
Yeah.
all of the elements are contained in water and reflected in water.
Even Rupert Sheldrake, I mean, he's a big, I think I'm a big fan of his, but he says that the sun is conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting because if the sun is so much about water, then that also makes sense to me. It's a very interesting one when we start diving into that, into those areas, because my friend Moses Hackman, he also says that water is the glove on the hand of consciousness. And I think that that's a really beautiful piece. And I kind of been smiling when you've been talking, because you said you couldn't remember what you talked about when I said there were lots of mic drop moments in my advanced workshop where you shared that. And it's because of the things you just shared. I think that for me, when I hear you speak, you're so great, because you can remember so many details of things that you've learned about, whereas I tend to be one of the people that tends to learn from just only my experiences, like what I've actually done, seen, and I'm sure you learn from that too, but I don't tend to have the recall that you do. So that's why I think it's so wonderful that you're able to share your information out there, because you're able to weave the science with this kind of ancient wisdom together. And I think the piece that I bring to the table is the art. I always say that art is the heart of water, and water is designing in these incredibly intelligent ways. I've discovered that water can communicate in these three types of ways, which are one of what I call signature patterns. So each type of water, say tap water or distilled water or rainwater or spring water, tend to have their own signature patterns. And we'll be able to see them when we freeze it using my technique. And you go, oh, okay, it's water sharing something important about itself. But then also it can design artistically. And so, it might design my cup, if I have my cup sitting even near the petri dish. And what's interesting is if I keep using my cup as an inspiring influence, I won't see the same exact picture over and over again. What I'll see are aspects of the cup quite often. So an above view of the cup, a side view, an under view. Sometimes even if there's writing on the cup that I haven't even noticed, there'll be little letters relative to that word that's on the cup. So, or even a date or something like that. So it's interesting because water is showing that it can see things from this multi-perspective kind of nature. I did one with an Egyptian hieroglyph, a tablet of an Egyptian kind of hieroglyphics. And it was interesting because I did about 4 of them at the same time using the same picture. And what I saw was that tablet. The first one looked very much like what I was looking at with my eyes, but then I saw it from the side, from these angles, and it was like water was showing me that I could see it from all these different perspectives. And one of the things that I've learned, and it is really interesting, because I had, for example, I did various different, lots and lots of thousands. I have 36,000 photos of water responding in this way. I'm prolific. But I have my petri dish of water. I had a butter knife on top of it, and so that was the influence. I removed it and then froze it. But without really even thinking or noticing, there were these round coasters on either, just kind of beside the petri dish. So when the water froze, the image I saw of a butter knife, but beside it were these 2 round circles which looked just like the coasters. So it was showing that water was, it was showing me that it saw the knife, but it also was showing me it's so much more than that. And one of the most powerful ones for me personally, because I have so much compassion for this situation, was where I was, I don't know, you can't even remember how this came about. I think someone sent it to me. It was this YouTube video of a sow, like a female pig. And it was this bunch of pigs were being taken to the slaughterhouse, and they were in a truck. And one of the pigs managed to jump out of the truck and survive. And apparently a nice story is somebody actually managed to get that pig, and now it's living out its life somewhere nice. But what was interesting is the water was part of that process of me watching it. There was a water in my petri dish, and when I froze it, there was 2 pigs that appeared in the ice. And I'm not just saying these are just not random, let me make it out, or maybe it kind of looks like this. Like, just to put that into perspective, my friend and colleague and mentor, really, Dr. Gerald Pollack, he said, well, listen, why don't you do more of a bit more of a science test? He said, why don't you have 25 of your photos and put them into a questionnaire and ask, what does this look like to you? So I did that a few years ago, and I gave it to friends to circulate around social media so people didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't know what this was about, and they didn't know it was from me. And what was interesting is that 85% of the people that answered the questionnaire, there were 298 people that answered it, and 85% of people could recognize the images for what the influence was, and out of 3 of them, 100% of people could recognize the imagery. So just so that we know these aren't random pictures. And so with these 2 pigs that appeared, I mean, one was the obvious one. You could see this look on its face. You could see the details of even the kind of spiky hair and ears and eyes and everything. But there was one just below it. And so what water was showing me was that, yes, it saw there was the pig jumping out that we all saw, but very likely there was another pig below it that was also trying to jump out with it. And so I see that water sees far more than I do within this realm. So that's that truck going back, squeaky brakes. And so I think that that's kind of where the power of our mind's eye is. It's I had a situation once where I wasn't able to see for a while. I had some things happen to my eyes, and so I had to wear like eye patches. And after a couple of weeks of not being able to visually see, I actually started to realize that you can see a lot in this realm. There's a beautiful story about Radha and Krishna. It's a lovely love story, and they're talking amongst each other, and they say that when one goes away, they hold the vision of their beloved in the rooms of their eyes and close the doors of their eyelids. And I always think that's so beautiful and very relevant within these terms. But before we go, I want to talk about do. Sorry, I need to try and,
Can I just share one quick thing about what you just said before? Because I'm excited to talk about dew. This is like one of the most magical healing forms of water in the entire world. But
yeah.
I have a theory as to why this is that, or how it works that water is able to receive something and then actually add a completely different dimension to it and then share it back again. So we can see in the laboratory, for example, that any frequency that you feed to water, she's not necessarily going to respond with the exact same frequency. Oftentimes she will refine that frequency. And this comes from the work of Jonathan Butts, who I think is one of the most brilliant water scientists in the world. Like, he has just my utmost respect for his understanding for water. And so he has shown something that pretty much no other researcher ever has, which is that water is refining things by the phi ratio. So even if you expose water to a really degrading influence like 5G or something like that, if you give her time to rest and time to integrate what she's seen, then when she comes back, she'll keep refining that by the phi ratio until it becomes a harmonic frequency. So she works with this capacity to actually turn anything into this evolutionary process, into something that is beneficial for life if she's given the time to kind of rest and reflect. And without going into all of the science of it, because I know it's getting to the time, and I really want to make sure that we can talk about dew. But what we can see in the hydrogen atom is that hydrogen has the capacity to actually open black holes within itself. So this is one of the many, many things we'll be going into in the Spirit of Water course that's starting next month. If people want to go deeper into the science and the spirituality and the consciousness of water, there's going to be so much in there. So I'm not going to go into all of it, but just for now, just take it on my word that the water can open up black holes. I know, as intense as that sounds, but basically what happens in a black hole is that all light and information and sound and mass and everything is brought back to the 0 point of oneness, to the source point of all existence that is completely transdimensional and encompasses all times, spaces, and dimensions. And so because water has this constant communication, this constant access to the quantum field, and in fact, I actually think the etheric field is the mind of water, and hydrogen is the spirit of water. I think because of that energy, that information, that visualization, that art, whatever she's seeing goes into the source of all consciousness, and then it comes back out through water, interpreted in a way that is slightly different than what she receives. It's her own perspective on it. Might
It's
maybe upgraded by the phi ratio each time by these spiral dynamics.
It's interesting because, like, even in the Vedic scriptures, they talk about these different kind of horses, and there's the idea of there's the person who's holding the reins, and then there's the reins, and then there's the horses and all the different senses. But there's like this the intellect and the mind and the spirit, and they're all connected, but they're slightly different. And when you're talking, it kind of reminds me of those aspects and of kind of the subtleties of water within this incredible human body that we're in. But these are the kind of things I'd love to be part of that course that you do, because this is the area I think that water has naturally taken me, because I think it's always been even as a little child, like my name, Veda, my mum didn't even know what the Vedas were when she named me. Yeah,
Wow.
She came over from England on a Russian ship to New Zealand, and she made friends with a Russian woman who worked on the ship, and her name was Veda. So when I was growing up, Mum called me Veda, but over the course of time, lots of people have started calling me Veda, so I love both. And
I love it. Veda is like the life force essence, and Veda is like all wisdom through history. It's a powerful name.
But even my middle name is Karan, Karan, because bless Mum, she was a terrible speller. So my middle name was going to be Karen, but she spelt it the way it sounded to her. So I ended up with these two Indian names because Karan is Arjuna's brother's name. And so I remember at 5 years old, I went to school. I started school, and I remember the teacher asking me, and she said, "So who here knows what the name of somebody who rides an elephant is?" And I shot my hand up. I'm like, I know. And I was like, it's one of the questions I actually knew. And she said, "Oh, what do you think?" And I said, "Oh, it's called a mahout." And she said, "Oh, that's right. How did you know that?" I'm like, I couldn't answer her. I couldn't say I knew. And so it's led me on these incredible journeys over to India. But what I'm going to read about and for the Kiwis out there, I'm saying do. And I think my computer just died, so I wrote it literally on this box because I knew my charger is not in the house, so I knew it was likely my computer would die, which it just has. So I wrote it down. So in the Rig Veda, which is part of all the Vedas, and this isn't like me saying, this isn't anything about different people's belief systems or anything. Like, I'm very much incorporated. I think they all intertwine in some way, and that we can learn from all of them. I just find this really interesting. So firstly, this is what I often think about dew as being kind of it goes a vapor that basically turns to a liquid, which is very interesting because it's kind of like spirit to matter. So I find that aspect very unique about dew. So it says in the Rig Veda, there is an endless net of threads throughout the universe. And at every crossing of the threads, there is an individual. And every individual is a crystal bead. And every crystal bead reflects not only the light from every other crystal in the net, but also every other reflection throughout the entire universe. And this is in relation to do. And I think that that is such an incredibly beautiful and profound thing that to hear and
It's
to
Indra's
read
net, right?
and yeah, and
Indra's
to
net.
unpack.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. So, and Steiner actually, Rudolf Steiner used that quote, and I was going to share the bit that he said because it actually related to Atlantis. He talked about Atlantis in relation to do, but my computer's died, so I'll have to share it at another time. I
Oh,
might
please share
share
that. Maybe I'll put it in the description of the when I post this.
that would be, yeah, sure, I'll send it to you.
Great.
Yeah, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well, because I look at things in a very philosophical way. I think that's my nature, as an kind of as an artist, really. That tends to be the way my mind goes. I love the science. I love to combine it all, but I'm naturally artistic.
I love this so much, and I'm so glad that you shared that because it's so true. We are all made of the same water, and water weaves us together with the very fabric of reality, not only in the physical dimension, but also in the spiritual and the etheric dimensions as well. And when you deeply get in touch with your body water beyond its unique, specific vibrational resonances that mean your personality and your memories, but you get to the consciousness of the water itself that you're made of, that to me has been the clearest point of union with all other beings that I have ever experienced in any medicine ceremony, in anything. It's really going through the waters that I recognize absolute oneness. We are all made of the same waters. And dew, I think, is specifically precious because it contains higher levels of ormus than any other kind of water found in nature. So you also find it at some springs, but throughout the centuries, water wisdom keepers and, witches and shamans, they've all particularly valued dew for this rarefied spiritual quality that it has. And when you release the chrism oil, it is like a drop of dew that comes right at the fontanelle of the forehead. So ormus elements are basically elements that are spinning at such a high vibrational state that they start to basically pierce through the space-time continuum and spin so quickly. And they're mono and diatomic as well. So they're very, very small. They're almost non-matter. In fact, ormus actually stands for orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. And so it's like almost past the state of being matter into the state where it's pure light. So these elements are basically vibrating at pure light. So there's so much light in dew. And for the fact that it actually is, I don't know if evanescence is the right word. No, evanescence means that it's kind of dissipating. It's like the opposite of evanescence, where it's congealing kind of from spirit into matter. There's another transcultural myth where so many different wisdom keepers in various cultures have said that mist is actually not fog, but mist specifically, which has different properties from fog, actually can act as a kind of portal, a veil into other realities. And so when I think of dew, I don't think of it as being the condensation of fog or the same kind of condensation that happens with rain. I think of it as being the condensation of this very fine transdimensional mist. And I really want to hear your take on it as well. And I also just saw that we have Anwin Avalon in the chat, who is the water priestess. She is an incredible water wisdom keeper of all of the Druidic and Celtic traditions of water witchcraft. So Anwin, if you want to add anything in the chat about dew as well, I would love to hear your perspective. I know you're quite an expert as well.
I would also say that dew is the first water that sees the light of the sun as it comes up. And it's one of those beautiful things when you see in photography where the dew is like, there's usually that morning light coming through it. And I think that that's a very powerful aspect to that it's like a new baby in so many ways, like it's just been born, and the sun, like a kind of father aspect, is like showering his love, and the mother of the earth is kind of like also there's this, it's the in between, it sits in between them both, the children. It's like the child, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
mother and father, father and mother, and it's very powerful and beautiful. And
Yeah.
I feel like there are so many ways you can look at water. You can, and every aspect you look at, it can take you down this incredibly beautiful journey. But the wonderful thing is that it starts to make the things you apply it to make sense. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
the big of life and the ideas about consciousness and Godhead personality, or God as the impersonal or personal aspects of God, but it absolutely ties in with the overlay of water in its many different um, stages and phases and subtleties. And the more you do it, the more you look, the more you search, the more you read, the more you feel, however you learn, because we all learn differently. And I see that with the children, is that we really are bodies of intelligent water. I always love this thing. We see the entire world through the lens of water without realizing
Mm-hmm.
it, because our eye lens is 99% water. So we are
Mm-hmm.
always seeing the world through this liquid lens of water. But because when we see with those eyes, we see this body that's so solid, we tend to think that that's what we are, but we're only ever a cut away from leaking, or an emotion away from leaking, or an exercise away from leaking, or various other things away from leaking. And even down to procreation, you know, these are fluids, and these are fluids that are intelligent, incredibly beautiful fluids that are uniting. And the world in which, and you know, in the areas of amniotic fluid, there's so much information within those areas, and that's a space I really want to dive deeper into, because for me, after studying egg albumin, which is egg white, for so long, I've started to see that, and many people that know my work would know this, and I know you already know this, but I still think it's interesting for those that don't. Um, in a certain area of the egg white, when you freeze it, if you've got fresh, free range hen eggs, you'll see 6 patterns. And you only see 2 of those patterns, the most rudimentary 2, in caged hen eggs, if you even see them. And so what's interesting is that when you put a caged hen egg next to a free range hen egg overnight, I've started to see that the caged hen egg will start to have more complex patterns, and it doesn't negatively affect the free range egg. So when I put one free range egg and surround it by a caged hen eggs and leave them overnight, and I've done this twice now, what you'll find is that by proximity, there is like healing. So the eggs that are right beside the free range egg all begin to look exactly like free range eggs crystallographically. And the
Mm-hmm.
further away they are, the less complex the patterns, but there is still positive change and noticeable change. But what's interesting is that whether this happens, whether it's in a fertilized egg or not. And so these patterns are there even if the egg isn't fertilized. So it's as if this intelligent water is there ready to already impart information to the potential of an embryo.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes into what came first, the chicken or the egg. I actually think the fluids of this water are such a powerful piece in that question, because
Yes.
there's even aspects to one of the patterns that I see. It looks just like feathers, and this is relative to all bird species. I believe I've done goose, quail, chicken, and duck eggs. They all have the same patterns, and I'm very
Mm-hmm.
curious to see whether crocodile eggs or snake eggs, for example, would show different patterns consistently, like what I'm seeing. In which case, we're seeing information specific to the species. And that ties in with Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance potentially and various other people's work.
I was just going to say it's the morphogenic field, and water has direct access to the morphogenic field. I feel like it's another word for ether, and so the morphogenic field itself is part of the mind of water. So the way that water thinks, the way that water sees and perceives is through this energetic realm of patterns and signatures and energies. And what I really love about what you're sharing is it comes down to, at least for me, because a lot of my work, at least what I share publicly, has been in the realm of, hydration and how can we actually, improve our body water and become more crystalline in that way, because I felt that that was a more accessible entry point for me to start sharing all of this more esoteric stuff. Like, okay, well, what can people actually put into practice in their lives? They can put into practice the hydration practices. But it shows that even just doing that, improving the crystallinity of your body water, is a form of service to your entire family, to your entire community, that you can become a living blessing that uplifts the field of anyone that you hug, uplifts the field of any water that you drink and goes through you and back into the watershed, uplifts the field of any water that you swim or bathe in. You literally become a resonating physical manifestation of goodness, and it's like a service to the entire world. There's one of my favorite, I even had it burned into my wrist actually, is seva, is selfless service. I feel like the more we really lean into the universal goodness of how can I serve, how can I serve, how can I serve, how can I give, and it doesn't even have to be a conscious doing, like let me go volunteer or something like that. But in Taoism we call it wu wei, which is the practice of doing without doing. And when you align yourself with water, you end up in the flow where continuously more and more you are doing without doing. And one of the best ways to do good without even having to work hard at it is just to uplift your resonance and become a more crystalline, structured body of water. And then just like all of the eggs around you, all of the people around you will feel it, even if they only feel it in the subtleties of their subconsciousness or of their morphogenic field.
Yeah, it's like that try, not try, try, don't try.
Yeah.
But, it's absolutely right. And there's just so much depth in this. And I think, like I've said, and it's you've kind of just said it too, is that you started out studying about hydration and teaching people about what is hydration and these kinds of areas. But it's so impossible from my perspective, from speaking to so many people that study water and observe water from all different walks of life, is that it tends to take you down this route of relationship with self,
Yeah.
reflections of self, and also of the more spiritual aspects of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I remember speaking to someone who was very much a hardcore atheist, and um, and we were just having conversations, and I was just sharing about what I've observed in water and various ideas that I have around how potentially spirit doesn't doesn't die. There might be spirit, like there might be this energy that animates the body, and that it potentially leaves through this kind of aspect of water, through a kind of change. And we know that water can change. We know so little about water, though. What we know is like a
Mm-hmm.
drop in a giant ocean.
We know nothing about water.
We know, I keep thinking I know. It's the moment I think I know something, I realize I know nothing, and that
Exactly.
kind of
All I have
moment.
to do is go have a conversation with Jonathan Butts, and then I'm like, I shouldn't even be teaching. I don't know anything about water.
But at the same time, it's an important role to actually share what we're learning and seeing,
Mm-hmm.
not to tell people what to think, but to pose questions that so that something might grow in them to decide for themselves, is this something that resonates for me or
Mm-hmm.
not? And because we
Yeah,
are
it's
all
like,
bodies of water, there is that possibility that the water within us, if we just kind of come to a more still place, we'll see the reflection of truth within it.
yes. And I think just like you said, it's not about making definitive statements or teaching, saying what anyone should do. It's saying, here is this incredible mystery. This mystery is called life, and it becomes a liquid, and it is you, and it's inviting you to get to know it in your own unique way. Water is constantly inviting us into the mystery, and it is an endlessly multifaceted mystery because she herself is completely fractal and infinite in nature. And I love that every single person has their own entry point into water. If you are passionate about ecology, you have the most incredible opportunity through serving water to remediate all of climate change, because the replenishment of the hydrological cycle could restore balance on the planet faster, so much faster than carbon sequestration or any of these other ways that we're chasing our own tails. Or, if you are passionate about health and wellness, the more we study the biology of quantum biophysics, the more we realize that hydration is health, and that dehydration and different forms of dehydration and destructuring of the body water are tied to every single disease. If you're passionate about human rights, there are massive human rights violations where water is actually being used as a weapon of war and a purveyor of poison all over the world. It's like, no matter what way you have come to this planet to serve, water is inviting you to serve through her. And you can make the biggest ripples of impact when you touch the world by touching water, because water suffuses everything. It's the oneness of everything. So if you want to make a difference in the world, everyone has their own beautiful way of doing that. And I love the way that everyone speaks a different language, like you were saying. But the one thing that we all have in common is water.
It's beautiful. And I feel that, for me anyway, I watch water coming from the mountains, going down, always making its way through all these different tributaries, going back to its source, going back to the sea. And we're all on this journey going the same direction in many ways and we might not even realize it. We might go, oh no, my life is so different than that person and so different from this person. But we are like from the same source and coming back to source, and we are source at the same time. So it's also kind of realizing that we're like source on a journey, and we're going back to ourselves. And I think water's always in search of itself, which is why we tend to search for love, why we tend to search for the mirror of ourselves and somebody else, why we tend to search for someone who inspires us. And there is often a search in the world. And I see, even when we're searching for life on other planets, we're searching for water on other planets. Water, I feel, is always in search of itself, which is where that kind of desire to like see ourselves reflected. And we might not even realize that's what we're doing sometimes, and we might see something we don't like. And I see that in my work sometimes, and it's like, that's why to me water is a spiritual teacher, upholding me to my truth and seeing myself in these little worlds of dishes. And each time there's so much to share, but sometimes the hardest part is not seeing the worst in you, but seeing the best in you. Seeing the way water sees us in this pure way. Sometimes the images are so incredibly beautiful and profound, and like, this is a reflection of me. So
You
sad
can't
that
hide
we've got
anything from water.
no. And I feel that, children are an important piece to this. So I often teach in schools. I teach children how to do this work and send them home with pictures of their work, and or however we do it, and we do a kind of science art project. But when these children are able to see, wow, like water is somehow responding, it's got this, it can change structurally, and it's super easy, and it only takes 5 minutes in the freezer, and let's do this. It's like this little light bulb switches on, and they can teach us so much. I'm going to have to go in 5 minutes, but I would love to share one of the things that my children have taught me. And I think it's profound, because I just got another email today of somebody using this for their health and saying that it made a big difference. So my children have kind of grown up watching me do this crystallography, And my daughter Shanti, she's definitely like an old soul, and she would come up and say, "Oh, when I just photographed the eyes," and she'd say, "Can I have that, mummy?" And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." So I'd give her the petri dish of ice, and then she'd proceed to eat it. I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she was like, "Oh, it's good for me." I'm like, "Really? Oh gosh, I okay." And so then when my son came and asked to do the same thing, and when I asked him, did Shanti like tell you about that? And he looked at me blankly like, no. And I'm like, oh gosh, what do these children know that I don't know? And I stored it away. And then over the course of time and teaching hundreds of people how to do the work I do, um, I have a little team of people that work around the world with me, and one that some of them are parents. And so one lady, she said, "Oh, my children do that too." And the more I share this, the more people are saying, "My children eat the ice when I do crystallography. So why are they doing it? Like, what do they know?" So my beautiful partner Ryan, he had done a study on plant medicines using words and using my technique. And what he did is for 1 week, he basically used the word ayahuasca and froze the water and took like photographs of all of the results for ayahuasca. And that's actually, his whole study was fascinating because I've never done it, where he actually got sequences for different plant medicines in the different, it was like a long conversation he had with water, where he had two hieroglyphs in the front, one saying organism, the next one saying visionary, and then there were two more we haven't identified. So just those two alone as a visionary organism for these plant medicines, but this didn't have the same sequence for LSD. That was different. Anyway, so what he would do different was he'd start eating the ice after he'd do these tests. And so he ate like a week's worth of ayahuasca. And after the week, he was like, I think I might need to start taking this a little seriously. And then that made me think, because he started to have some kind of feelings and things that you might relate to that plant medicine. And so I thought, oh, that's so interesting. So then I started sharing it, and people have started to write a word that resonates for them. And there's a lot of people, it seems, out in the world that have insomnia, and a lot of people have written the word rest. And a few of them have come back to me saying, I ate the ice after using the word rest, and after doing that, I've actually started to have the best sleep in the last 4 years. And so it's really early days, but it's in a liquid crystal stage. So rather than blessing your or using words as your influence in the molecular chaos stage, which is the liquid water, as water begins to freeze, but before it's frozen, which is the area I teach in my technique, it's in this more fourth phase stage, in this liquid crystal stage. And because words, it's like water is absorbing the energy of a word and crystallizing that, and then you're eating that, it is a very profound, strong, powerful modality to start using and eating this. It's kind of like homeopathy, but different. It's kind of like, what Luke
It's kind of
Montagnier
like
was
the
doing about.
anomalous water that Dr. Flanagan spoke about, where he said that, inside of every snowflake, there are actually veins of living, flowing water that is the anomalous water that takes longer to freeze. And they actually,
Yeah.
Dr. Kowanda and Dr. Flanagan together did studies showing that the longer the lifespan of the circulatory system of anomalous water inside of a snowflake, the longer the lives of the people who drink that water from that region. And so it makes sense then that this would be healthy for those people who are eating, the anomalous water that has been exposed to the different influences.
Yeah. Well, it's very
Yeah.
exciting, and I love that the children taught us
Yeah.
this. But I have to
They
go.
know so much without knowing. Thank you so much for joining this chat. This was so fun talking to you. I feel like we could talk about water forever and ever and for days and days, and it's such a treat. And I feel similar to how I did after we did your advanced workshop, that I just feel so nourished from this conversation. So please share with people where they can find your work, how they can connect with you, and if you have any upcoming events or anything that you would like to share that you want people to know about.
Sure, I always feel the same way about you. I'd love for us to connect in person one day and do
Oh, I would
something
love that.
together. I'd love that because I think honestly, the more I've kind of connected with you and seen you and heard you, I think that you share just such deep value for people. I really would recommend people going on your courses because, you've taken such a deep dive, like you said when we first say, you ready for a deep dive? I think we're both diving as deep in this. It's like this abyss. We have no idea how far it goes. But people can reach me on my website, which is vedaaustin.com. I think you'll link me here, and you probably have already on Instagram, but it's Veda Austin _water. And on Facebook, it's Veda Austin @water researcher. And I have a beginners workshop coming up. I always keep my beginners workshops small so that I can help everybody get their freezer setting right, and it's very interactive. That's coming up for me. It's on Sunday. For people in the US and the Europe area, it's on Saturday. So for me, it's the 30th. For you guys, it's the 29th. So you can go on my website, and I think there's like 2 spots left. And then towards the end of November, I'm going to have my very, very last advanced workshop of the year. And I usually only do 3 or 4 advanced workshops, which is kind of really a masterclass where I go over all the really, what you would say is juicy questions around consciousness, art, thoughts, material, what is the area of dream studies that I've done, where water has literally shown me what I've dreamed in the ice, and I only test the water that I've forgotten the dreams about, so that when I see the image, it actually has jogged my memory. So we kind of go into those areas. We go into some really beautiful areas around intimacy, about how our intelligent water, even our saliva, a great example of that might be that you might be sort of on the fence about somebody. You might like, oh, I kind of like them, but I'm not really sure. Well, as soon as you kiss, that kiss is going to make you just have this inner knowing, yes, I want to take this further, or maybe not. I think we should just be friends. But the saliva exchange shares so much intelligent information between the two of you that no words could ever convince you of. Your intuition, your internal waters kind of get so much information from that kiss, from that saliva, and that is just the very, very tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of where we can go in the areas of intimacy and all those kinds of things. So I find that really, really interesting, as well as sharing some of the pictures I've done of different structured water systems and vortexing systems, and how consciousness impacts water, and what do signature patterns look like, and how do I freeze egg albumin so that I can see this for myself, and all of that stuff. I pack it all in because basically it's like all my work and studies and the new things I've learned, which is always something new every day, about water. So I'll be putting that up on my website, available pretty soon.
Beautiful. Well, I definitely recommend that anyone who has heard any portion of this live today definitely go check out those workshops. They're, as you said, they're very juicy. They're full of all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So thank you again so much for this conversation today, Veda. I look forward to the next one, whenever that might be.
Me too. Thank you so much. And lots of love to everybody that joined.
And I just want to let everyone know that I have a Spirit of Water course coming up. We're starting in November, and it is the very first time that I have ever done live webinar style teachings in my courses. And it's also the first time that I'm sharing more of this esoteric and mysterious and spiritual and quantum teachings. You know, all of the courses that I've done so far have mostly been to do with, you know, biology and hydration and that sort of thing. So I'm excited to take a deeper dive with you guys in this course. And you can find that at waterslife.academy. And we'll be starting on the 7th of November. So enrollments will close then, and it's going to be a closed container, but it's going to be super, super deep. And then also, I have a retreat coming up, a water retreat, and it's going to be the 3rd to the 8th of February here in Tulum. We'll be at a beach, we'll be at cenotes, we'll be doing underwater janzu, body work, underwater dance, we'll be doing water ceremonies, water workshops. It's going to be a very, very hydrating retreat. So join us for that. I haven't made the official announcement. I'm thinking enrollment is going to open for that on Monday. So please stay tuned for that. And thanks again to everybody who joined us for this chat. I will be saving the live on my page so you can go back and watch it again if you want. So, okay. Thanks everybody. Have a beautiful day and stay hydrated.